Hey you! You're watching a clip from the DynamiteGizmo podcast. This is not the full episode, but if you want to see the full episode, make sure to click the link in the description. And remember, like, comment, subscribe. Do it now! Here's the clip. Anyway, let's talk about Flyweight. Because there was an interesting fight card that happened this past weekend. Royval and Manel Kape headlined that event. And there are moments in UFC where over the course of one or two events, everything in a division changes. All of a sudden, multiple guys have legitimate opportunities to rise. And that's exactly what's happening right now at Flyweight. Last week, we saw Joshua Van claim the belt from Alexandre Pantoja. And that same week, Tatsuro Taira picked up another big win. And just before that, Kyoji Horiguchi had a major win of his own, with his debut back into the UFC after his long and treacherous veteran of a career. And then this weekend, as I said, we had Manel Kape versus Brandon Royval. So now you look at the division and there are options everywhere. But as New York Rick put it, there's one big monkey wrench in the mix, and that wrench is Alexandre Pantoja. Because let's be honest here, 100% Pantoja deserves the next title shot over anybody else that I mentioned. The problem is we're at a standstill until his arm is fully recovered. And the question becomes, do we just wait? Or do we keep the division moving in the meantime? I don't think there's enough time to simply just wait. So when you look at the current landscape, the clean answer is that Manel Kape should get the next shot. He just beat Royval. That puts him at number 2, I think, because I haven't even checked the UFC rankings. They were updated yesterday, but because there's no fucking UFC news, nobody's talking about it. Let's see. Okay, Manel Kape. Yep, he rose up 4 spots. He's at number 2 rank. Okay. But now things get complicated. Because the UFC is reportedly going to Japan in either April or May. And if that's the case, Tatsuro fits perfectly into a title fight on that card. Joshua Van has already said he doesn't want to do that. His stance is that he is the champion and the contender needs to come to him. And I get that, but let's be real here, Joshua Van. You're 24 years old, you're still fresh in the sport, and you won the belt off of a freak accident. Now, it's not undeserving by any sense of the word, but if the UFC is going to Japan, it makes all the sense in the world to put you against Tatsuro Taira for the title. So then the next question becomes, what do we do with Horiguchi? Do we put Horiguchi against Manel Kape in a title eliminator on that same card because of the fact that Horiguchi is Japanese and he's the next, he could be potentially one of the next contenders? That feels a little unfair to Kape, though. But the way the UFC has been organizing fights lately, it's absolutely something they could do. And this is where Kape's story gets a little interesting when we really dive deep into Kape himself. Because there are 2 crazy things about Manel Kape's UFC career that people don't talk enough about. First, out of his 10 fights in the UFC, he's only lost 3 times. His first 2 losses came back-to-back when he first signed with the UFC, and his very first loss in the UFC was to Alexandre Pantoja in his debut. After that, he lost a split decision to Matthias Nicolau. Then he went on a 4-fight win streak before losing again to Muhammad Mokaev, which is a whole separate discussion about whether or not Mokaev needs to come back into the UFC at some point. But let's bring this back to Japan. One of the reasons Kape might get brushed over is because we've got both Horiguchi and Tatsuro in the mix. actual Japanese contenders going to Japan. But what a lot of people forget is that Manel Kape has a deep history in Japan as well. Manel Kape used to fight in Rizin. Not only is Rizin Japan's biggest MMA organization, it's one of the biggest in the world. And Kape didn't just fight there, he became the champion there. What's wild is that Kape's first loss in Rizin was actually to Kyoji Horiguchi. And immediately after that, he lost to Kai Asakura, who is also now in the UFC. And Kai's UFC debut was also against Alexandre Pantoja, but it was for the title, and he came up short. Now, Kape continued his run in Rizin, picked up more experience, and then in December of 2019, he fought Kai Asakura again. This time it was for the vacant flyweight title, and that time Kape won, becoming the Rizin flyweight champion. He then vacated the title to come to the UFC, and we already know how that story came about and what happened. Now, Horiguchi himself has also fought Kai Asakura multiple times in Rizin, including taking the title from him at one point. So when you look at the history between Kai Asakura, Kyoji Horiguchi, and Manel Kape, there's a deep Japanese MMA storyline there that honestly outshines Tatsuro, at least from a historical perspective. Now, obviously, Kai is on a 2-fight losing streak in the UFC, so he's no part in the conversation of going for the title. But Manel Kape is the current number 2 contender, a former Rizin champion, and he has history with 3 of the biggest Japanese names connected to the UFC flyweight division. Because of that, there's a real chance that Kape actually does get the next title shot in Japan. And initially, I thought maybe you do Tatsuro versus Horiguchi in the co-main event as a title eliminator. That makes sense on paper, and it tells a clean story. But now that I say that out loud, I don't think it works. I don't think it's smart to put Japan against Japan on a card like that in Japan. I don't think it's smart to put a Japanese contender against a Japanese contender in Japan. So what do we do instead? Maybe the answer is Tatsuro versus Van for the title, and then Horiguchi versus Manel Kape in a co-main event. They're going to Japan, and who knows when they'll ever be back. You need all these guys on the card. Tatsuro is ranked number 3 and nearly undefeated in the UFC. That matchup makes sense. And now there's an opportunity for both Japanese contenders to get their wins in their home country. I wouldn't be surprised if they even throw Kai Asakura somewhere on that main card as well. I mean, why wouldn't they? One last thing that needs to be mentioned. This is a fight night, okay? Remember, I'm talking about titles here. This is a fight night. Now, normally you don't see title fights on fight nights ever. But remember, you got to consider this, okay? The UFC is now with Paramount, okay? So there's no more pay-per-views. Technically, if you're in Canada, you still have to pay the pay-per-view price. But, you know, the UFC is signed to Paramount, so they don't have pay-per-views anymore. So there is no longer an incentive to save all the title fights strictly for numbered events. There was a time when title fights happened on fight nights back in the day, and we might be heading back in that direction. So what do you guys think? Is this good matchmaking, or am I completely missing something here? Does this actually make sense? And who else on the UFC roster could realistically headline a Japanese card? You gotta let me know, dude. You can't just sit there and talk shit about my take without saying your take. I need to know what you think, my guy. Come on.
Tap here to watch the full episode of the Dynamite Gizmo podcast.